Hi, thanks for joining me. My name is Mindy Mandell, and this video is part of a series of videos on Proclus's Elements of Theology. Today I'll be talking about propositions 176 through 178. For those of you who would like to look at some of the past videos, I will link the playlist here. As I've been doing throughout the series, I am using the E.R. Dodds translation. And for those of you who do not have the text, there is a link in the description box for a PDF version. So today I'll start with proposition 176. And this one reads, all the intellectual forms are both implicit each in other, I would say implicit in each other, and they're severally existent. So the intellectual forms, or intellectual realities as I prefer to call them, they're both in one another and also distinct and separate from one another. Now the explanation opens with a reference back to proposition 171. You'll see that here. So I think a look back at that proposition would be helpful. And this one states that every intelligence is an indivisible existence. Now, Proclus showed us in this proposition that every intellect is without magnitude, body, or movement. And in the course of the explanation, he clarified that even though intellects are manifolds, they are unified and they're therefore indivisible. This is going to be a factor in proposition 176. Proclus is building on this idea. So back at proposition 176, Proclus starts off his explanation by stating that every intelligence is indivisible, and through this intellectual indivisibility, its manifold content is also unified. And that's proposition 171. That's what we just looked at. So now we want to see what follows from this. So I'm going to take this in pieces. The first piece states that all the forms, or the realities, being contained in a single intelligence devoid of parts, would be united with one another, and all interpenetrate all. So we're looking at an indivisible manifold. What would that look like? It must be somehow a single intelligence without parts. But the image that Proclus is forming for us is still not complete. We do need the second part of this conclusion. Proclus adds to that image this: but if all exist immaterially and without bodies, there is no confusion among them, but each remains itself, keeping its pure distinctness uncontaminated. Okay, this is key. If I ask you right now to picture the outside of your home, you can see one unified image in your mind. Yet you can also make distinctions. The doorknob is not tangled with the door. The doorbell is not confused with the wall. Now this is a limited example, of course, because it's in the realm of physical things that can be separated from one another. The door, for example, can actually be removed, and same with every other piece. Among the intellectual realities, or the forms as they're usually called, this intermingling is complete. And yet, in an experience of beauty, for example, we can also recognize justice. We can see proportion and equality. We can see greatness. We can see motion. We can make a number of distinctions. We cannot separate them the way we can the parts of our home, but we can make these distinctions. Each intellectual form, each intellectual reality, is a single intelligence devoid of parts. It is distinct in itself. They do not blend. It is not like mixing blue paint with red resulting in a completely different color. A better but still imperfect example would be mixing sand with sugar, or maybe salt with pepper, which is probably tastier than sand and sugar. Distinctions can be made. Elsewhere, Proclus uses the example of shining light through the air. The air is not light, the light is not air. They are distinct, yet they are mingled. It's still an imperfect example, though. When you're talking about the intellectual forms, the mingling is complete. Okay, here's the next paragraph. The focus here is on the distinctions. That the intellectual forms are unconfused is shown in the specific participations enjoyed by the lower principles, which may participate any form in independence of the others. In other words, lower principles can participate distinct realities. This shows that the intellectual realities do not blend, and so they don't lose their distinctiveness. And Proclus explains further. For were not the participated terms mutually distinct and separate, the participants could not enjoy each of them discriminately, but the indiscriminate confusion would exist a fortiori in the later principles, since they are inferior in rank. From what source could they derive discrimination if the forms which constitute and perfect them were indistinguishable and confused? So if the intellectual forms were blended, then those forms would be even more so at lower levels. Since they can be participated distinctly, they must be distinct at the level of intellect. Okay, now in the third paragraph, Proclus is going to show the unity of the intellectual realities, or the forms, that all are in all. This sentence starts off, on the other hand, the unity of the forms is evidenced by the undivided substance and the unitary existence of the intelligence which embraces them. Now, the word substance is the Greek word hypostasis. Hypo means under and stasis means standing. So you can think of a hypostasis as an underlying state or a fundamental reality. It's the basis on which the realm exists, if you will. The word existence here is ousia. I've mentioned this word a few times. This denotes the intellectual act of reverting to itself, and thus knowing itself. This unity of the whole turning on itself is the very being or existence of the intellect, or ousia. I like using the Greek word because it allows for a more dynamic image than what I imagine with the English word existence. Now, this ousia is unified and unitary, and it embraces the forms or the realities. It knows them, and it knows that it knows them. And so, rereading this sentence with the Greek words that we just talked about, the unity of the forms is evidenced by the undivided hypostasis or underlying reality, and the unitary ousia of the intelligence which embraces them. Proclus goes on, for things which have their being in a unitary principle devoid of parts, existing in one same mind without division, how should you divide that which is one and without parts? Must be together and mutually implicit, interpenetrating one another in their entirety, and without spatial interval. Reversion can only occur in that which is incorporeal and without parts. So intellect, then, being of this nature, allows for the realities that comprise it to interpenetrate one another without spatial interval. And here is how he rounds out the paragraph. For that which contains them is not spatially extended. It does not, like extended things, embrace a here and an elsewhere, but it exists all together in an undivided unity, so that the forms are all implicit each in other, or they're all implicit in each other. So physical things are spread out spatially. However, the forms, or the intellectual realities, they cannot be. They cannot be next to each other. They cannot be spread far apart. How could they be? They're not physical, and so they do not have physical properties. So without physical properties, how could they be separate? Thus, Proclus concludes that they are implicit in each other. Okay, now the last paragraph. Scroll it up here. The last paragraph. Now Proclus will pull it all together. He's going to combine the distinctions that were shown in the second paragraph with the interpenetrating quality that he focused on in the third paragraph. Thus, all the intellectual forms exist both in one another as a unity and also each apart in its distinctness. Now, as an example, he uses the intellectual aspect of a soul. If, in addition to the above proofs, anyone should feel the need of examples, let him consider the theorems which are contained in a single soul. All of these, existing in the same unextended substance, are united one to another, since the unextended embraces its content not spatially, but without partition or interval. The word substance here is ousia, by the way, not hypostasis. And it can be really confusing when translators translate different Greek words with the same English word. But anyway, the basic gist of this sentence is that we can hold many ideas together and they have no spatial distance from one another. At the same time, they are mutually distinct, for the soul can produce them all in their purity, bringing out each by itself and drawing forth nothing of the rest in its company. And the soul's activity could not thus discriminate them were they not permanently discriminated in their passive state. So at the same time, distinctions can be made and clarified. This, in fact, is an important aspect of doing philosophy. If distinctions were not possible, perhaps there could still be the experience of unity, but it would be without any ability to make distinctions. In other words, we would be able to have experiences, but we would not be able to reason about them. We could not understand them. This is a big part of what attracted me to Platonism. Many wisdom traditions can bring students to experience, but none makes sense of experience quite like this system does, or at least that's my own biased opinion. And the last part of the sentence, by the way, is important. The soul's activity could not thus discriminate them were they not permanently discriminated in their passive state. So if we can see both unity and discreteness at the level of soul, such as demonstrated here or that I demonstrated a few moments ago with beauty, then surely the same principles must exist in the intellect that the soul participates. So going on to Proposition 177. This one reads, "Every intelligence is a complete sum of forms, but certain of them embrace more universal and others more specific forms. And while the higher intelligences possess in a more universal manner all that their consequents possess more specifically, the lower also possess more specifically all that their priors have more universally." What we are seeing here is a flow in the unfolding of the intellectual realm. Now, the logic of Proposition 177 is rooted in the principle captured back in Proposition 62, which shows that power is commensurate with unity. I know we've seen this one a number of times, but it really is key here, so I'm going to just make a quick review of it. Okay, so every manifold which is near to the one has fewer members than those more remote, but it's greater in power. For that which is near to the one is more like to it, so it will be more unitary, less divisible, but it will be more powerful. Okay, with this in mind, I will return now to Proposition 177. And Proclus starts off his explanation this way. For the higher intelligences, being more unitary than the derivative, exercise greater powers, whereas the lower, being more advanced in plurality, thereby restrict the powers which they possess. For those principles which are more akin to the one, while their number is relatively contracted, excel their consequence in power, and of those more remote, the opposite is true. And so there's the reference to Proposition 62. So this principle is the basis that Proclus is building on. And Proclus goes on. Accordingly, the higher intelligences, manifesting greater power with smaller numbers, produce in virtue of their power more effects by means of fewer forms, while their consequence, through defect of power, produce fewer effects by more forms. Well, there's a bit of a mystery tied into this. How can there be fewer realities at the higher realms and more at the lower? What does that mean? Well, the next sentence gives us the answer. Now, if this is so, the forms embraced in the higher intelligences are more universal, those in the lower more specific. So here's Proclus's answer. At the higher realms, the more potent realities are wider in scope, and that's why they can produce greater effect. As reality unfolds, then, it differentiates into many more specific realities. Okay, going on now to paragraph 2, it starts with one very long sentence. And this reads, from which it follows that things generated out of the superior intelligences in virtue of a single form are produced parcel-wise from the derivative intelligences in virtue of a number of forms. And conversely, things produced by the inferior intelligences through many distinct forms are produced through fewer and more universal by the higher. What is general and common to all the participants comes to them from above, but the particular and peculiar quality of each species from secondary intelligences. In other words, higher principles are more universal than the lower principles. And this idea was implied in Proposition 62, but it was first introduced and more directly in Proposition 60. And Proposition 60 reads, whatever principle is the cause of a greater number of effects is superior to that which has a power limited to fewer objects, and which gives rise to parts of those existences constituted by the other as wholes. So higher principles are more powerful and comprehensive. They have greater and more universal power. To see an application of this, Proclus showed this principle specifically in regards to gods in Proposition 126. And this one reads, a god is more universal as he is nearer to the one, more specific in proportion to his remoteness from it. And now what we're seeing in this video is that the same principle extends beyond the gods into the unfolding of intellect. And so the conclusion of Proposition 177. Hence, the secondary intelligences, by their more specific discrimination of the forms, as it were, articulate and elaborate in detail the formative work of the primals. So this is that general principle, and Proclus is showing us this principle put into action. In Proposition 178, every intellectual form is constitutive of things perpetual. And in a nutshell, this proposition is an application of Proposition 76. This one reads, all that arises from an unmoved cause has an invariable substance. All that arises from a mobile cause has a variable substance. Substance here, by the way, is hyparxis. So yet another Greek word being translated as substance. I've heard hyparxis described as the fullest flowering of a thing, if that helps. But anyway, we want to keep Proposition 76 in mind as we go through Proposition 178. And the main takeaway here again is that an unmoved cause creates an invariable effect, and a mobile cause creates a variable effect. And Proclus's explanation begins, for if every such form is eternal and unmoved, it is the cause of substances invariable in their existence and perpetual, not of things which come to be and perish. Thus all that has its subsistence in virtue of an intellectual form is perpetual. So Proclus is currently focused on the realm of intellect. Intellect is eternal and unmoved. Therefore, the forms, or realities, which comprise it are equally steadfast. It is when you get to the realm of time and space that the temporal are introduced. But what Proclus is telling us here is that the immediate consequence of intellectual realities are invariable. And Proclus goes on, for again, if all forms produce their consequence in virtue of their mere existence, and their existence is perpetually free from variation, then their products likewise will be unchanging and perpetual. So I think the logic of this argument is clear enough. Proposition 26 is worth reviewing. And this is another one I've jumped back to multiple times. This one reads, every productive cause produces the next and all subsequent principles, while itself remaining steadfast. It imitates the one, and if the one brings its consequence into existence without movement, then every productive cause does so. And to wrap up Proposition 178, accordingly, things which have come to be at some point of time cannot take their subsistence from a form as cause, nor can things perishable as perishable have a pre-existent intellectual form. For were their subsistence related to such forms, they would be imperishable and without temporal origin. So this is the natural consequence. The intellectual realities, or what Dodds calls forms, are immutable and eternal. Now, this proposition has many parallels to Proposition 172. And this one reads, every intelligence is directly constitutive of things which are perpetual, and as regards their existence, invariable. So this is another application, really, of Proposition 76, and that was the general principle that an unmoved cause creates an invariable effect, and a mobile cause creates a variable effect. Here in Proposition 172, Proclus is focused on intellects, whereas in Proposition 178, he's getting more specific by focusing on intellectual forms within the series of intellects. Okay, so that brings me to the end of another video. In my next video, I'm going to wrap up this section on intelligences. So if you found this video helpful, I would appreciate you giving it a like, and also please subscribe if you don't already. That really helps the channel grow. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, please do not hesitate to leave them below. Thank you very much.